Welcome to Inside the System, an exclusive, limited series podcast brought to you by the Sistema.bio team. In this series, we open the doors to our own conversations. We share our vision, our challenges, and the ideas driving us forward as we shape the future of climate action. Sistema.bio is a social enterprise that operates across the globe, working with farmers to improve life on Earth by advancing climate solutions and sustainable agriculture. Sistema.bio is the biogas and regenerative agriculture platform dedicated to working with farmers by providing access to innovative biodigester technology, training, and financing. No filters here, no scripts, just real, honest exchanges from inside the world's largest carbon farming network. Hi, I'm Esther, Chief Strategy Officer at Sistema.bio. It's a pleasure to be your host today as we take you inside the system. In today's episode, we're diving into why 2025 has the potential to become a true turning point for the carbon world. Lately, the conversation around carbon markets has been loaded with uncertainty and setbacks. We at Sistema.bio see a different path forward, filled with opportunities to evolve and to push the boundaries. This is a moment to explore how innovation, as well as putting in the hard work, can reshape the landscape and prove that meaningful climate solutions are ready to step up. We have two speakers today, and first up, Ed Agnew, our Global Carbon Partnerships Director here at Sistema.bio, with deep expertise in carbon markets, climate policy, and clean energy. He previously led climate and impact initiatives in the project development space, contributing to both voluntary and compliance markets like Corsia and pioneering Article 6 programs across Africa. He himself comes from a farming background in Scotland and is passionate about delivering climate finance directly into the hands of farmers. Hi, Ed. It's great to have you here today.
Hi, Esther. Thank you.
Joining us as well, we have Rafa Eberle, Carbon Strategy and Program Manager at Sistema.bio, where he focuses on carbon policy, climate finance, as well as government relations. Before joining Sistema.bio, he worked as a strategist in the carbon markets, supporting organizations in shaping their climate and sustainability strategies. Hi, Rafa. Welcome.
Hi, Esther. Great to be here.
So to kick us off today, I'd like to ask you both to begin with, if you had to explain to your younger self what you do today, how would you describe it in one sentence? Why don't you get us started, Ed?
Okay, one sentence.
One sentence. It can be two.
Okay, I might need a few commas in there, but let me try. In one sentence, I would say, as humans, we continue to mess up the planet, and therefore we need to find ways that mitigate the impact we continue to deliver. So, how can we do that? How can we place a price on the environmental damage we as societies and countries are causing? So this might be a second sentence. By placing a price on those negative outcomes, we can actually direct financing to activities on the ground that are doing some good environmentally and also socially, to try and help countries and businesses decarbonize and help us limit the damage, all the while delivering climate justice. That was a long sentence, but yeah, that sort of theme, I think.
I'll try that on some children. We'll see. Rafa, over to you.
Yeah, I think I would summarize it as bringing climate technology to those that need it the most in the world.
Amazing.
That was much sharper than mine.
I've practiced on my, when you have to explain it to your grandparents, what you do for work, and carbon markets is always quite an abstract one. So I've had my fair share of practice already.
Amazing, amazing. There's been so much movement in carbon markets over the last few years, and I'd love to zoom into the last 5 months, beginning of 2025. What have been some of the surprises both of you have seen, maybe Ed, in the carbon markets? Any big changes or surprising effects?
I think what's surprising is maybe just the time everything takes, but that is by necessity. I think we're moving into an age of, we hope, a slightly more connected global carbon market under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Which was obviously signed at the back end of 2015, and here we are 9.5 years later, only just getting to the point of seeing it all come to fruition. So whether or not that's surprising, I don't know. I think it is necessary to an extent, frustrating as it is, but we do need to build structures, markets and mechanisms that are sort of with very strong foundations and built upon integrity and ultimately that people can trust. I think there have been lots of lessons learned from the CDM era, from aspects of the voluntary market to date. And so, yeah, I think the time that is required to see things move forward is, if not surprising, certainly frustrating, but necessary, I fear.
What about you, Rafa? What have you seen?
Yeah, I think if I think about it very concretely, it's probably the core carbon principles and the decision that came out on household devices that we as a biogas company are also sort of grouped under, that had been in the process for several months. And I think that was maybe the biggest one so far this year, concretely. I will maybe wait a little bit before we dive more into technical details, but that would be my short answer.
What does it mean to have these core carbon principles? I mean, without getting too technical, why was that a new development for you?
I think at a high level, it's trying to address this fragmentation in carbon markets, right? We unfortunately, as of today, do not have one single global carbon market, but rather it's this network and sort of microcosmos of different carbon markets that differ in size, but also in what they're trying to achieve in the companies or entities that participate in it. And so these core carbon principles were an attempt very much focused on the voluntary carbon market, but for sure also with effects on sort of compliance markets and Article 6, to harmonize that a little bit and to have this minimum threshold, let's say, for carbon credits that carbon credits need to meet in order to fall under this core carbon principle category. And maybe, at least from my own sort of expectations, I was positively surprised, I would say, how stringent the ICVCM, so the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, was in the end, and a lot of project types and specific methodologies were also excluded. And so I think there was a lot of excitement and anticipation for that final decision, and at least from our point of view, it was a very positive one. So we had the methodology that we rely on, which is a gold standard methodology. And so a methodology at the end of the day is a pathway to calculating emissions reductions from our projects. It was approved, and so that for us, I think it provides a lot of clarity on the way forward, and I'm sure this is a concept and an idea that we will also keep coming back when we talk about 2025, how important it is to have very clear rules and guidelines at a standard level in order to scale the market as a whole.
Great. And I think part of that integrity, that focus on integrity and quality, has also been really pushed by new technologies. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Can you help us understand what technologies, what role they play? What are some examples maybe that are used in the industry?
Ed, do you want to take a first step at it, or should I go?
I think I might defer to you here with your
Right.
more technical expertise. Sorry.
Sure.
You can have a free pass to dodge a question next time.
No worries. No, I think sort of conceptually there's been a lot of progress over the last 15 years, let's say, from a technological point of view. And I think what we're talking about concretely is the monitoring process and procedures that come with a carbon project. So maybe somewhat oversimplified, but at the end of the day, a carbon project or carbon credit represents this delta between what happened before the project was implemented and thereafter. So in our example, that is the farmer will have some type of manure management system on the farm that generates methane. And then by installing the digester, this methane is fed into the digester and captured and used on site, for instance, for cooking. And a key performance indicator for any type of project is how much are the systems being used, what other effects are there that maybe weren't foreseen at the point of installing the system in our case, or implementing the project more generally. And so technology has helped a lot, both in the forestry sector, which I'm sure there would be other experts that are sort of better suited to speak about it in more detail, but with the sort of coming up of satellite imagery, obviously AI, where we just have a lot more data. And maybe a point that people don't fully appreciate sufficiently, or something that I think about quite a lot, is how access to data is such a huge challenge in the climate space more broadly. So put yourself in the shoes of, let's say, Kenya, and you have to report your emissions inventory to the UNFCCC, so the international climate body. There's a lot of complexity there, and getting access to reliable data is sort of the first step in any climate journey, and that also applies to companies in a similar fashion. And so their technologies have helped and are increasingly helping in us just being able to obtain more granular data, which also allows us to make more precise statements around impact. And maybe what is important here to, well, maybe at least quickly mention, I won't go too much into details, it's that in climate accounting you have what are called tiers. So basically, the higher the degree of certainty that we have around a certain parameter, the less conservative we need to be. So a very concrete example of that is for our emissions reduction calculation, the weight of the average cow that our farmers have is a really important input parameter, and we use a default value by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is sort of the UN's main scientific body. And the value we use is 285 kilo per animal, which we have quite a lot of reliable data, including data from the Indian government, that is quite significantly too low. So on average, the dairy cows will be 300 to 400 kilos, if not more. A very sort of grown full dairy cow can also be 600 kilos in weight. And so, but we're at this point in time not able to go around and weigh every single animal. That would just not make sense economically and logistically. And so we use this default value that is just quite a bit lower than what we would know. And so it ends up becoming sort of this layer of being extra conservative. If one day we had an amazing AI tool, let's say, that could scan a cow and tell us the exact weight of the animal, then that for us would mean we have more granular data, and it would help us in the monitoring. And so that's one example that is maybe a bit, well, we'll see if we get there one day. In the short term, for us concretely, we acquired a company called Inclusive Energy last year and have sort of integrated them into our carbon programs now. And that's a gas flow meter that can simply track the usage, but also other important parameters such as leakage and venting of the system. And so that allows us to make much more precise statements around around how our systems function in the field on a day-to-day basis.
So Rafa, what you're basically saying is how data is crucial in climate projects. It's the from the baseline to actually calculating the actual emission reduction. This is very crucial, but also highly complex and tedious. And so projects can have the option to defer to default values or can go prove their own values. But this is where technology would really help accelerate the precision and the accuracy of emission reductions. Is that a right way to summarize?
Yeah, that's pretty spot on. And the important takeaway is that default values are not, it's not maybe the right way to think of it, more or less accurate. It's just that as soon as you use a default value, it's extremely conservative, that default value, because it needs to sort of account for the fact that there can be outliers, etc. And so we, as a project, from a project developer's perspective, you're always incentivized to use more accurate data, because normally that results in higher emissions reductions if you are able to prove with concrete data that this is really the case.
Great.
Maybe just to jump in, sorry, Esther, but I think in general, building on what Rafa's saying, and also the developments earlier this year around the core carbon principles, I would characterize it as, all stakeholders within carbon markets, within government environment ministries and beyond, society at large, we are trying to move towards a world where there is just greater certainty. Certainty in environmental impact, in claims made by companies or governments or carbon market actors, that 1 ton, let's say as an emissions reduction unit, or what some people would call a carbon credit in certain cases, that 1 ton avoided or reduced or removed is on paper at least 1 ton in the real world. So we want to be able to calculate that conservatively and with confidence, such that there's far more certainty. And that's, I think, how the market's going to develop. Ultimately, it comes down to trust. I mean, I'm sure we wouldn't be the first to make that point, but we just need to be able to trust that a ton is a ton.
And maybe I can give one more example that's a bit less carbon markets related. That's maybe also interesting to any listener that is not sort of knees deep in carbon markets. I read this article in Nature, I think last year, where when we think like all of our climate targets as a world, we say, okay, we want to, limit it below 1.5 degrees and if possible, even below 2 degrees and if possible below 1.5. And there's even some degree of uncertainty as to how far or how much global warming we've already experienced. And one reason for this is that when we started collecting data on the climate and annual temperatures, there was a really big volcano eruption, I believe somewhere in Indonesia, that led to a higher concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in the short term. And so the reference years that we have, we're not sure how reliable they are. And there's this principle in sort of the climate space in general, which dictates that, sort of 100% certainty should, or not having 100% certainty should not stop us from taking action. And obviously this is a space that is evolving, but just because we don't have 100% certainty with regards to some specific details, it doesn't mean that we should not take action and take that as an excuse, but rather work with what the best available science that we have at that point in time. And that's obviously by no means meant to be an excuse for developers to try the best and obtain as much data as possible and really also push those new technologies.
I mean, the whole sector is under a lot of scrutiny, and that's from the project developers themselves, but also there's been a lot of recent announcements from corporates claiming net zero pathways. More recently, there's been more political developments from governments creating their own carbon platforms or committing to joining global initiatives. What have you seen there, Ed, that you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge at the moment is when we think about climate action and financing climate action, financing the energy transition, that's quite a hard thing to do on a voluntary only basis at a corporate level or at a government level. If we are asking people to do the right thing or to contribute towards meaningful climate action out of the goodness of their corporate or governmental hearts, then I think we're hitting our heads against the wall, because as soon as there's any form of economic pressure or financial pressure on a company, that kind of voluntary ambition would probably be the first domino to fall. So yeah, generally I think I believe in the concept of, in this context, sort of carrot and stick. I think we need to incentivize companies and governments to take action to deliver mitigation outcomes to achieve their NDCs. At the moment, there's no real method of accountability, as I understand it, to hold a country to account if they massively miss their national targets under the Paris Agreement. That's not ideal. I think we need to be able to hold countries to account. I mean, God knows how you do that politically. And then for companies, we need to not seek to penalize companies that are trying to do the right thing. I think one recent example would be the legal suit filed against Apple for the claims it made around, I think it was a carbon neutral watch. I personally find it incredibly frustrating that they are, I'm not an Apple user, don't get me wrong, but I think it's nuts that we're trying to encourage action on the one hand, but then a company is doing the one thing it can do by delivering financing to projects and trying to decarbonize aspects of its supply chain or its operations, and then they're held up as a scapegoat. Well, in my head, I'm thinking, what about the numerous organizations that choose to do nothing? Because that is an active choice. But yeah, so ultimately, I think we need to incentivize companies to take action and governments to take action. We need to somehow reward, maybe through fiscal incentives, those that do in a credible, accurate way. We need to find ways for companies to talk about the action they're taking in a way that doesn't freak them out reputationally, that they're going to be accused of greenwashing or face a lawsuit. And then, yeah, we ultimately need to, I think we're going to have serious penalties that are meaningful to companies and governments for missing targets or for continuing to operate a damaging business as usual scenario.
The international lawyer in me wants to sort of contradict a little bit what Ed mentioned. I think, obviously, from a personal opinion perspective, I disagree in general. Like, it would be great to have more what you refer to as accountability or penalties if countries miss their targets. What we've seen historically, though, is that under Kyoto, which is the Kyoto Protocol, the predecessor to the Paris Agreement, is that what is often referred to a top-down approach didn't work in practice, because then countries just stepped out. Canada is a good example. They had signed up for the first Kyoto commitment period, and sort of towards the end of this period they realized that, actually they were supposed to pay a lot of penalties, and then they quickly stepped out last minute to avoid paying those penalties. So within the confines of our current international legal system that we have, I think there's an argument to be made that there is a real upside to having this sort of more naming and shaming and soft power approach to the Paris Agreement, which I know, as for the average person, and myself included, can feel quite frustrating, that it feels like, okay, governments are not punished for doing enough on the climate, but on the other hand, it's maybe still, from a pragmatic point of view, more effective than having a system where no one participates in the first place.
Yeah, I understand that. And I agree with the logic there. I mean, I would also make a distinction between the countries that have historically got the biggest footprint and have caused the bulk of the climate crisis we find ourselves in, I think it would be completely wrong and politically impossible, let alone ethically, to try and hold to account for missing an NDC target, a lower income nation or a developing nation that has contributed next to nothing towards the global climate crisis. So yeah, there would have to be layers, and maybe the kind of soft power name and shame approach is the best tool we have at the moment, and we just have to hope that countries kind of stick to their word and account accurately, and don't try and sort of fudge the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to refer to this naming and shaming. I think as much as it's probably necessary in some cases, if you're greenwashing or lying, it seems like on the opposite, talking about the carrot and the stick, we're celebrating very little or never in the carbon space. So I was curious if each of you wanted to share maybe some best practices or an example of a very successful project, or what it would take to be celebrated in the world in the carbon market space. What would that take, Rafa?
I think there are a lot of positive examples. This year, off the top of my head, I think we're celebrating 20 years of the EU emissions trading system, which maybe could be classified as sort of the most effective climate policy law that is active in the world. I think it's been a large success overall. I think there's also very, very large support politically for it across different spectrums within the EU. So I think that has been a really successful instrument as a whole today. There were a lot of challenges with it at the beginning, and it took many, many years for that market to mature. And then we see a lot of promising political developments across the world. I maybe focus a bit more on the countries on a day-to-day basis where we also have operations. So, for instance, Colombia comes to mind, that has for a while already now worked on, well, they have a local carbon tax, but in addition, it seems to be relatively high on the political agenda to build out an emissions trading system there as well. Mexico is working on something similar. And yeah, so at a high level, I think there are a lot of positive developments. It's just important to have patience with these things. If you think about it, in the EU, it took probably more than 10 years to have a price that was sort of significant enough in order to really drive decarbonization. Then that should inform and give us a little bit of patience with, let's say, Colombia as well, which has been working on this for quite a while as well. But it's difficult to set up these systems politically and also from a technical perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest challenges to maybe Article 6 in general, but scaling a more coordinated global carbon market, is what Rafa explains, this notion of kind of technical capacity building. It's not easy. You can't flick a switch and suddenly have all the expertise a host country government could possibly need within its ministries and so on. It takes time for that expertise to develop and to learn from best practice elsewhere. And so, yeah, of course, we would all love there to be a really legit, really sort of well-oiled machine, as it were, for a global carbon market today, with everyone speaking the same language, everyone with a common view on what good looks like, what is best practice. But we're still some way from that, clearly, and it really does take time. I mean, I think if we take the example of Kenya, for example, that Kenya is a leader globally in Article 6 readiness, and getting to where they are today with some pretty robust and like broad, far-reaching carbon market regulations that have been really well thought through, well considered. The government today is thinking about its carbon budget, so making sure they don't overissue corresponding adjustments, taking it seriously. And these are very difficult questions that need to be addressed at a sectoral level, and to the earlier point, with as much accurate data as possible. But this isn't an overnight thing. Kenya, to enshrine Article 6 in law in the country, required an act of parliament in August 2023, the Climate Change Amendment Act. From there, okay, then you need dedicated carbon market regulations, which came 9 months or so later, May 24. There are processes under the UNFCCC system. You need to, appoint a national authority. You need to start thinking about your carbon budget. All of these steps, it takes time. And so I think the more that international organizations can support various governments all over the world in their sort of Article 6 readiness, the better. And that's probably where we are now. I think we would love there to be a faster pace, but it's also really important that governments and as a planet that we get it right, because if we screw this up now, then all faith and confidence in carbon markets as what we believe to be the most effective tool currently available to deliver mitigation outcomes and climate action and climate justice, all trust will be lost. So we've got to get it right. So do it once, do it well. Sure, keep iterating and improving, and we will with technology and so on. But it takes time, and that sort of political, technical capacity is really, really important.
Yeah, it sounds very complicated indeed. But at the end, the hope is more climate justice, less emissions reductions, and a whole range of benefits. What would be in it for Kenya specifically? I mean, what is their main motivation to take all of this years and years of effort on them to develop their own carbon market or adhere to the global one?
So I think if we think about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and Rafa, I reckon you might know the precise wording with the lawyer in you, but I think the first clause of Article 6, 6.1 is around raising ambition. So the whole point of this mechanism is to raise ambition. So I believe that a government like Kenya, far be it from me to speak on their behalf, but I would imagine they're thinking in terms of how do we raise ambition within our jurisdictions. So how can we use international climate finance to deliver the green industries of the future, to deliver energy transition, to protect our natural resources and carbon sinks, and that might require international climate finance because it can't be done at low cost domestically. It requires this sort of additional funding. So the outcomes are conditional on that funding being delivered. So yeah, for me, I think it is all about raising ambition. How do we scale new industries that are typically higher cost? Maybe it's electric vehicles, or maybe it's green hydrogen, or ammonia, or something. Obviously in our case, we'll argue for improved manure management, glamorous as that sounds on farms, but a vital way of decarbonizing agriculture and reducing something as climate forcing as methane in the short term. So yeah, sorry for the long answer. I'd say raising ambition is the name of the game.
And maybe adding on to what Ed mentioned, that's a really dramatic shift from carbon markets under Kyoto Protocol, for instance. And I do think a lot of the conversations that we are having surrounding carbon markets, around integrity, they often come back to the same switch in this global policy framework where under the Kyoto Protocol you had very few countries, so-called Annex 1 countries, mainly the global north. In the end it was, I believe, just the EU left that was sticking to the second Kyoto commitment period. But under Kyoto, sort of, let's say before 2020 or before 2021, the purpose of carbon markets was to enable emissions reductions at the lowest possible abatement cost. And that was it. So carbon markets were really, it was a tool of efficiency at the end of the day. It was meant to allow these Annex 1 countries to reduce their overall costs for achieving their emissions targets. Whereas under the Paris Agreement, because suddenly all countries have their own climate targets, going back to Kenya, for instance, Kenya cannot sell its cheapest emissions reductions anymore because it needs that to achieve its own NDC. And so now under Articles as the nationally determined contribution, so under the Paris Agreement, every country submits to the UNFCCC its so-called NDC, and it's ultimately a plan and a target that they set for reducing emissions. Most commonly, that target year is 2030, but there's a lot of nuance there as well that I think we don't need to dive into in the context of this conversation. And then figuring out for countries, and Ed alluded to this, to understand what constitutes high-hanging fruit for us, what do we need for our own NDC. That's a very complex process, and what we have seen a lot of countries do now, and Ghana is a good example for this, is that they have published a carbon framework with a very clear white list and a red list. And so project types on this white list, and in case of Ghana, for instance, biogas is explicitly mentioned there. Those are the project types that would be considered to be above and beyond the ambition of Ghana itself. And then everything on the red list, so forestry conservation, for instance, is on there. That is sort of off limits for project developers, and that will be done with national resources alone.
You've both been mentioning a lot of examples from Kenya, now Ghana. What are some other regions or countries that you think are interesting to highlight?
I'd maybe highlight India as well. Obviously, it's a market we're very familiar with at Sistema.bio. But yeah, India this year has published in more detailed plans for a domestic carbon market. And I think it's a really interesting case study. I'm sure government there is grappling with how does domestic industry decarbonize affordably. You know, you don't want to cripple domestic industry. You don't want it to be at a competitive disadvantage versus international competitors if the price is too high. So to Rafa's point, you need to ensure that there is the availability of domestic projects or domestic credits that can enable that to occur without crippling industry. At the same time, you want to deliver major economic development and social outcomes on the ground and drive some of the high-hanging fruit industry development and so on. India has also published, by the way, an Article 6 whitelist, as it's called, for project types that it believes will be exportable to global carbon markets. So it's clearly a delicate balancing act for nations to figure out, well, how do we achieve our own objectives? How do we deliver impact and economic outcomes and development of new green industries on the ground? And ultimately, how do we pay for what needs to be done? And ultimately, I think the notion of getting maybe wealthier nations or wealthier industries to fund that sort of climate action is, in my mind, very logical, particularly if those industries or nations have an outsized historic role in the climate crisis. But ultimately, it is one planet, so we've got to figure it out collectively.
Rafa, who would you highlight?
I would maybe move from South Asia to Southeast Asia. So, and maybe also switch from the sort of supply side to the demand side. I think in the APAC region, we have a lot of upcoming demand as well. So most concretely, the Japanese and the Singaporean governments that are trying to position themselves within that space. And there have been a lot of developments there. And yeah, I think all countries to some extent at the moment are really trying to build these frameworks, are trying to understand how they want to interact with Article 6. And that is also in part driven, so Ed mentioned this compliance scheme in India. These sort of developments are also in part driven by EU policy developments. So the EU, for a very long time, has given, we briefly spoke about the EU ETS, so the emissions trading system that we have in the European Union. And for a long time, industries that were at risk of what is called carbon leakage, so the underlying idea being that if the European Commission charges a price of 80 euros per ton, that these additional costs will mean that industries leave the EU and start producing just outside. And so these industries that were considered to be at risk, they were receiving these allowances for free. So essentially there was no real carbon price on those industries. And what the EU is proposing now is that rather than the European companies getting those allowances for free, is that any company exporting into the European Union will have to pay I can think of it as a carbon tariff. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And for a country like India specifically, this has massive consequences in terms of their export industry. So from the Indian perspective, they now want to understand, okay, how can we build our own carbon pricing that this money, rather than flowing to the European Commission, flows back to the Indian government and can be used to support Indian companies. And that's something that we see actually in a lot of geographies at the moment as well.
And like Ed was saying, it's all one planet. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter really who gets the funding as long as emissions drop. That's I wasn't aware of that. That's very interesting. Ed, what do you think is still one of the biggest misconceptions that people have in the carbon space?
I'd maybe highlight two particular bugbears for me. One is that, and this is maybe for people who aren't involved in carbon markets day to day, that the notion of carbon markets is just somehow a license to pollute. I find that really reductive, also inaccurate descriptor. And I think there's all sorts of data to support the fact that companies that are taking action and placing a price on carbon are actually decarbonizing more quickly and achieving better results. That combined with this this additional idea, which I truly still don't understand, that is that carbon removals are to be of a higher priority than avoiding emissions today or reducing emissions today. So it's that kind of either or mentality, which to me doesn't make any sense. I think given the scale of the crisis being the operative word, we need all solutions. And the idea that we kick the can down the road to 2040 or beyond, 2050 even, and say, okay, we'll scale carbon removals technologies today that might deliver those removals in the fullness of time. Okay, sure, we need to drive investment to those industries, and some of them are high potential, others might be more unproven at this stage. But Christ, we need to deliver action today. We need to stop emitting and reduce emissions urgently today. I mean, there's an analogy, I can't remember who said it first, but if we think of a bathtub that is overflowing with water, okay, you might pull the plug out of that bath, but you've also got to turn off the tap, stop the water going in. So I'm not saying it needs to be one or the other. I think we need all possible solutions as quickly as possible. And yes, that involves avoidance projects. That involves reduction projects. And of course it involves removals activities and engineered or nature-based. We need everything all at once, and this notion that it must be one or the other, or one should be higher priority than the other. I I don't get it personally.
Rafa, you'd probably say we don't need everything, but we should be a bit selective on the projects we choose, while speeding up, of course, because we understand the timeliness and the urgency for climate justice. What are, in your view, still some misconceptions, Rafa?
I think we touched upon a few of them. So one being this data topic that I think is maybe not appreciated enough, and then Ed mentioned this distinction between removals and reductions, which I think is a very important point as well. And then maybe to add a third is also this non-linear relationship of climate change and rises in temperature. So, and methane that we in our day-to-day life, or work life at least, I think a lot about. I don't think about it before going to bed just yet. But those are so-called short-lived superpollutants. So they have a very high impact on global warming in the short term. So for methane, over a 100-year period, 1 ton of methane emitted is roughly the equivalent of 28 tons of carbon dioxide. But if you look at it over a 20-year period, I believe it's 84, 86. And so over a shorter time period, there is a much higher impact. And that means that we unlock all of these, what are called feedback loops in what are complex systems in the mathematical meaning of that word. So these are really interconnected systems where it's often difficult to tell the difference between cause and effect. And often this example of the butterfly effect is used as to showcase this non-linearity of one action, how it can, like the wing of a butterfly can cause I believe a hurricane somewhere else in the world. And so that's, I think, super important to understand that all of this methane that is being emitted today, it kickstarts these feedback loops where, if you get more ice that melts, it unlocks additional resources of carbon dioxide and so on. And so I think as humans, we're not really well trained or not very well able to think of non-linearity and exponential developments. We think of it in sort of very linear terms. But yeah, the climate and also human society are not always linear. And so I think that's a point that is often underappreciated as well.
Great. We've spoken a lot about how things need time and how complex they are, and they require accurate data, a lot of political will, a lot of processes around integrity. Do you think we could be at the end of the beginning, like we discussed when we were preparing here? And could it be 2025? Could 2025 mark a turning point in the history of carbon markets? And how do you feel about that? Maybe, Rafa, you can get us started.
Yeah, maybe it's too early to already celebrate, but I think a lot of important foundations have been laid over the last year or so. Obviously, we had this big decision at the previous COP in Baku, where now at least the guidelines for Article 6 are clear, which I think gives countries a lot of the needed certainty on the core carbon principles. We have clarity. There are a few industry developments that are still ongoing. I think the science-based targets initiatives, there's still a bit of back and forth on the use of carbon credits, for instance. But in the grand scheme of things, if I look at all the developments combined, I do see it as the foundations having been laid, and most importantly, also very clear guidelines for what constitutes sort of a high quality carbon credits. I think for a long time that term was being overused a little bit, and everyone had their own definition for it. And so now we're starting to reach a a point where I think that's a bit more harmonized. And well, at least the hope is that this really instills confidence from a buyer side again and allows carbon markets to scale. And when I say carbon markets, that refers to both the voluntary market, which I do think still has a role to play, but my assumption is sort of that over the next 5 to 10 years, we will see more and more compliance markets and smaller schemes, and potentially over time, those schemes can go from a national level maybe to a regional level. And maybe in our lifetimes, we still see a truly global carbon market as well. Let's see. A truly global compliance carbon market, to be precise. Yeah.
Let's hope for that. Ed, what do you see still happening, the end of the beginning in 2025?
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Rafa said, which is lucky. I think there have been a lot of recent developments which are potentially game-changing. And yes, it would, as I said earlier, it'd be great if things could happen more quickly, because projects want to deliver impact today and tomorrow, not 12 months or 24 months from now. But that said, I do believe there are enough sort of green shoots of momentum in the market as people are getting a more common viewpoint on what constitutes best practice. As Rafa also mentioned, for too long, this notion of quality in the market, I think, has been way too subjective. So can we move to a world of greater certainty that a ton is a ton, as mentioned? I think the big theme, though, that I continue to see emerging, which also gives me, I think, some enthusiasm, is an ever greater focus on use of funds. So if carbon markets in a very broad sense are, in essence, a financing tool, a financial mechanism, well, I think the question at the forefront of everyone's mind should be, sure, where does the money go? Show us the use of funds. What is the cost of generating 1 ton, for example, and where does that money go? And I think getting greater focus on that theme is really, really important. Ultimately, with many project types, not all, but in our case, certainly at Sistema, I think delivering that carbon value back to the people on the ground, i.e. farmers who are making the positive environmental decision, is front and center. It's the right thing to do. It talks to, I think, themes of climate justice as well. So it's very important that if through their positive environmental decision, they're enabling a carbon emissions reduction unit, let me say, to be generated, okay, they need to see the value of that. And that's vital. So yeah, the use of funds, I think, is getting more prominence, also from host countries. If we think about, the potential for a fee, I'll try not to go too technical here, or I'll put another 20 cents in the jar. The notion of a fee for a corresponding adjustment, which to those who aren't geeking out on this stuff, is essentially like an export permit for a emissions reduction unit, or a carbon credit, if you will. To pay a fee to the host country government for that is actually important, because ideally that revenue to the host country will go towards funding the marginal cost of abatement domestically for maybe some of the lower hanging fruit that we talked about earlier. So again, in my view, it all comes back to use of funds, and I guess financial additionality, to use another buzzword from a market that has far too many buzzwords and acronyms. So I'll pause there before I say any more.
Amazing. Thank you, Ed, for I'll cover your 20 cents. Our time is almost up. Just one last question. If you had the chance to meet a very, very influential decision maker in the carbon space, and would have 30 seconds to advocate for something, what would it be? And I'll give you a chance to think about it. And whoever is ready can start. Who would it be, and what would you ask?
I don't know who it would be, but I think I would think of someone to ask, how do we get more certainty to projects on the ground to encourage investment? So that might be through policy measures, or it might be through certainty of carbon demand, or regulations in country. But ultimately, people want to invest from a position of certainty and confidence, and knowing that there is, I guess it would be to some influential policymaker in a jurisdiction. But I think the more certainty that can be brought, the better. That might be a cop-out of an answer. So Rafa, I bought you some time. Over to you.
You've been brave. Thank you, Ed, for going first.
I think it's difficult to, well, it's also a bit of a non-answer, but it's difficult to single out one specific person, simply because the governance system is not, like, we don't have a president of the world, right, that holds all the power. It's a very sort of decentralized and bottom-up process in a lot of ways. So maybe I would advocate with the EU negotiator, let's say. I would maybe to an extent echo Ed's sentiment, not just about investment certainty, but also how do we ensure that host countries have all the tools at their disposal to make informed decisions that then later on they can also honor. I think that's a really difficult aspect to, well, carbon markets in general, because they're not a physical commodity like gold, let's say, which exists as a physical commodity, whereas carbon is always dependent on policy and government support to a large extent. And so if we're looking at these projects that are long-term for us, our project technology lasts over 20 years, and at least under many of the carbon standards, we can generate credits for a period of 10 years. And we also need that long, what is called a crediting period, to recoup the initial investments made into the project. A lot can happen politically over those timeframes. And so it's super important that whatever documents are signed or guarantees that are made by host countries, that they are undergoing a proper due process, and that you have the certainty as well that because they did undergo those proper processes at the time, that these are reliable for a long period of time. And I think that's a big challenge that a lot of thought has been put into, but maybe there's not a very straightforward universal solution to this question just yet.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rafa. Thank you so much, Ed. It's been a pleasure to be with you on this episode. Thank you to all of our listeners. We hope today's discussion sparked some new insights and fresh perspectives on the opportunity in the carbon market. If you want to learn more about what we're doing at Sistema.bio, or would like to collaborate with us in any form, don't hesitate to reach out. You'll find a link below here where you can leave your details, and our team will be very happy to connect with you. See you next time. Take care, everyone.
Thanks everyone.